Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and today my co-host Michael Cook is very sad to not be here because we are talking with Will Yeske about his book, Damn the Valley, which tells the story of his deployment to the Arghandab Valley of Kandahar from 2009 to 2010 as a paratrooper with Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Will is the managing director of No Limits Marketing Group, and he holds degrees from Towson University. I hope I said that right. Is it Towson?
So
so close. Towson University, Cornell University, and Columbia Business School. So, dang, way to go with your education. Yeah, no, you definitely have done a good job there. Well, it's so great to have you here. I am really excited to talk about your awesome book.
I've been stoked. We've been waiting on this one for a hot minute.
Yeah, it's taken a while to do some scheduling, but here we are, and
it's all right.
I'm just really excited because there's so much to talk about.
I think it's kind of cool on how this even came to be, just with, it was really, Michael was the one that had this book coming out, on his end, and it caught my attention because I was like, hey, my time in Afghanistan, but then with how things were happening with my book to where, there's actual Afghans getting attention to this thing and reaching out to me. So I'm like, hey, Michael, do you have any idea on what organizations that take care of evacuation and refugee support? And then long story short, a few months later, here we are talking about this particular book, but with how all this ties in and where everyone just fell into place across the board. It's pretty amazing these days to have these type of technologies to be able to do this. It's nuts. It's really cool. It's a cool time to be alive.
It's definitely that way. And it's really interesting because, up till now, I don't, and actually to this point, I don't think that Michael has ever talked about his book on the podcast.
He's too humble.
Which is crazy. He's like, well, it's not my story. It's not about my story. And I'm like, well, you just wait. Like, everybody's interviewing him now. I'm going to interview him right after it comes out, and just, I don't know.
Good.
I'm excited about it.
He deserves it. I think all of us are like that because me too, where they're like, oh, this incredible book you wrote. You just said it. And I'm like, honestly, though, it's not the amount of stuff that was behind it from the other guys that they put forward, the efforts that they put, and the stuff that they gave. I didn't even have pictures for this thing, when the publisher asked. And all of a sudden there's a share drive with a few thousand pictures out there. And with the stories that these guys shared, you're looking at, they're opening up those traumatic points in their life and they're facing those traumas again. And they're doing it really so that we can put that story out there. That's a hell of a thing. And that's something to be said about these guys. There's not everybody talks about this stuff. You know that.
I do. Yeah. And I think it's so important to do that. I know that there are different schools of thought on how best to process those moments. Do you share them with other people, or do you kind of pretend they didn't happen, or just hold them really close to yourself? And I think that it's really valuable. There's a part, and I wasn't actually going to ask about this, but there's a part, the first death that you guys experienced, Johnston, I believe, you have multiple perspectives on that from different people. And I don't think I've ever seen that done in a book before. And it just reminded me because, I've studied a lot of war. I might be a civilian, but I've read quite a lot about war. And one thing that I do know is that two people can go through the same thing in a war zone, and they will have very different stories about what happened. And maybe sometimes it's big details, sometimes it's small. And I just thought that was so incredible that you were able to pull all of those in and kind of let other people have their story within yours.
That was one of the biggest things there, was getting all this. I know that's why I talked about it in the author's note. It's, you get 125 people at a traumatic event. There's going to be 125 different stories, and some of them are going to align, some of them aren't. The thing is, they're all true because that's the perspective that particular person who experienced it had. Yeah. So to them, and especially with that fact that if you don't face that trauma or that type of traumatic event in your life and you don't come to terms with it, you're kind of locked in. You're experiencing that again and again every day until you process it and get by it.
Oh God, you're preaching to the choir. For me, it's different things that I had to do that with. But yeah, I definitely have found that to be true. And I think I feel like I'm already bumping way ahead to like Operation Resiliency, which is one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen in both your book and Ben Kesling's book about Bravo Company, which is titled Bravo Company. So I think actually that will just lead to my first question, which is, tell the readers.
Back it all
yeah,
up.
let's start at the beginning. Why did you decide you were going to write Damn the Valley, and how did it fit into other books that were coming out about Arghandab at the time?
So, all right, here we go. How do we put all this in? This particular book is a book that I never wanted to write it. It was always that in the back of my head. And it was even kind of foreshadowed at Cop Johnston by Sergeant Robert Mussel, kind of joking around one day on the patrol hill coming off of it, saying, one day we're going to see a book with Yeske's name on the cover about this. And I was like, dude, there's no way I'm not writing about this. Nobody wants to know about like this stuff that happened out here. There's no way to put the, quite honestly, just with the amount. And then, I mean, you read it. When I talk to people about these stories and like everything that happened, and not even everything is in this particular book. This is just the stuff that I knew I wanted to dial in on, but there was so much more that I left for other people to pick up that story, because it was maybe more appropriate from somebody from 2nd Platoon or 3rd Platoon. And it was because of how saturated the area was we were in. There was just so much so where when Ben Kesling had come out and said, hey, I have a book deal for this, I was relieved. And I was like, I actually got in touch with him about, hey, this is who I was. I was with 1st Platoon, if you need somebody to interview about stuff. And we talked we had 2 or 3 sessions where we talked about, one of them was easily 5+ hours. We really dialed in. That's why when I laughed and I'm like, oh my God, like you've read Bravo. So that little sliver I was in there, the amount of information he went through in writing that just must have been, the scope was huge. And I think that that's what led to this one, was that it was so large scope to where a lot of the guys that were there kind of were like, hey, our story hasn't been presented. The story of the guy on the ground hasn't been presented. It's not complete. Like there's snippets of it. I think he did a great job with it, in my opinion, especially in the way of kind of getting the feel of some of the horrors and everything in there. But it just kind of became apparent that the guys were like, hey, we want something from one of us out there. And that's what led to me starting to put it to paper. I actually called Mr. Kesling first before I started it. And I said, in your professional opinion, like, do I have a story here, or am I just, you've heard my end, what should I do? And he encouraged me. He said, put it down. Like, this is history. This is something, just see what you got. And from there, once I pushed myself to have everything down before I actually looked at his manuscript, so it wouldn't be anything biased by it. And once I did, it was, I wrote it out in 2 weeks. It was a 60,000 raw manuscript, and I sent it up to Casemate, and I was like, hey, this sounds a lot like We Few by Nick Brockhausen. What do you think? And through a series of strange and just crazy, not coincidences, because everything happens for a reason. I really feel like this whole thing has had a resonance type to it, because it's just some of the other stuff we'll talk about during this. One thing led to another, and it was, hey, it's going to the round table in 2 weeks. Hey, you have a deal. And it was just like, what? Like, we have an actual published deal. And then from there, I knew I just had to hold myself to the fire. And it was, how can I put out the best possible product to honor what these guys did? And all right, let's go through making sure it's the most accurate, because that's a lot of what the guys were saying. Like, we want accuracy. Mm-hmm. So talk to as many as you can. Get this picture dialed down, get it through the DoD process. That was a bear.
Yeah, I bet.
It was easier said than, it was like uncovering it first and then finding out, oh, okay, that's it's not as bad as I think. And fortunately enough, I actually got a former infantry guy as the reviewer. So he loved it. He absolutely loved it. He ate it up. So we got it kind of the approval, the first one back within 3 months. So that was huge.
Wow. That's not bad. I want to say, just in case anybody is listening to this and thinks that I didn't like Ben's book, I mean, I will say I loved Ben's book, actually, when I read it, because and yours is very granular. It's like your perspective, the guy's perspective, just what you set out to do. It is so like, here's where we were, and we didn't have time and space to think about, just you're in it when you're reading your book. And Ben's kind of looking back too at like, what was the family experiencing back home, things that you guys didn't have to see. Like when you go to Dover, I couldn't believe this when I read his book. It hit me, the part about the living rooms, the different living room sets, because which living room set feels more like a place where you want to hear the news that your child has died. And it was just like, oh my God, you can't read the book. Or when you talk about Ben reading this book and getting through the reading without crying, and you couldn't have done it. I mean, he did a really beautiful job, but he did do it from all different levels. And so it is really hard, because you can tell too, when you're reading your book, how much had to be left out. How many patrols didn't get into this book, because it's so thickly detailed and rich with all of the things that are going on. And this is such a sensory experience. And you described that so well, that being in this war zone, you're just like, you're on. Yeah. You're on, and everything is so in the moment, and what's happening. And now there's an explosion, and now there's this, and these things are all going on simultaneously. And I think you did a brilliant job of telling those stories and making sure that is honored. But there were some people who really weren't thrilled that Ben wrote the book, but then that you wrote the book. And I wondered, what were their reasons for not being happy? Because you mentioned it in the introduction that they weren't happy that you were writing this. And so what were some of the reasons for that?
I think some of it was, like I said, when Ben's book was getting closer to being published, I started hearing, in these back channels, the way that these guys stay in touch, I start hearing chatter of, oh, this freaking journalist, and hey, he wasn't there. Oh, he's a damn Marine, and it's like, guys, like, stop. This is a professional writer that works for the journal. This is probably the best, chance you have of your story being properly presented. Some of them, and I kind of understand now too, because some of them wouldn't even talk to Ben. I had problems like where there's a few of them, very few, that wouldn't talk to me from First Platoon, but it's more of that. You have that kind of crusty old infantry guy who's like, we don't talk about what happens out there, and it's like, well, then you're going to turn into Clint Eastwood on the front porch, get off my lawn. You're going to be that combat veteran, which I don't really think is the right. There's going to be some out there that's what they want, and that's okay. As long as that's with them, all right.
And I'll say there are some things in there that I was like, wow, I didn't know that. I don't know if I needed like the splinter. What's the Gatorade part where the guy's, beating it into some fruit powdered energy drink mix, and it's like, hey, but that's it. That's the real thing. Or, the guy having to pull his pants up with like, dysentery shit going down his leg. Like that's a war zone, and it's just, everything. It's unfiltered. It's so, those things I don't know that anybody would say those need to stay, whatever. Like we can't share that. I feel like people kind of know that that's going on like a little bit here and there, but you're right. Like, and I loved how you acclimated yourself to the water, in Arghandab, like little bit by little bit, and avoided the dysentery.
I don't know if that was the best thing. I probably would get yelled at.
Yeah, probably. But hey, when, you're in a situation where there's no water, like, hey, you were ahead of the game there while the rest of everyone was losing what was inside of them. I don't know.
Tried to. No, I you know what? That's like the thing too, is like, I mean, I would have jugs of protein sent out. Like I was kind of fortunate in that way to where I had someone back home to where I'm like, hey, like you have the numbers for the card. Like, here's my list. And I think that was really due to the fact that I was in the talk, because it was really, man, most of the times, even when the satellite phone would come around, I don't even think I used it every time. Like, it was just, you didn't have much chance. And then if you did communicate back home, things would start getting in your head, in that sort of way. You might start longing to be back there. Hey, and then you're useless out in the battlefield because your head's not in it.
Yeah, I imagine that would be really a tough thing to manage.
Especially out there, I talked about it later on in there, but I mean, I remember the moment to where we were leaving for a patrol, and I was kind of like getting in my head on, all right, who's it going to be next? And I think it was because that was right around the time when we were losing guys and we were getting replacements, to the point of where one of those replacements, the very first patrol out with us, boom, hits an IED. Thankfully, it didn't take his leg. He probably hit the luckiest IED in that entire deployment. It just shattered his ankle. But stuff like that, when it's the amount of people that are being hit, and the fact that, I mean, you're not even seeing, and then finding out later that Walter Reed, that entire prosthetics ward was our guys.
Yeah.
They even opened up the wing even more, and it's just like, holy crap.
Yeah, that was the worst time. Have you read Run, Don't Walk? About Walter Reed? Oh, it's an excellent book about the amputee Ward 57.
Yeah.
And, that time that you guys were there, like, it's you, and then it's, Sangin, and it's Marja and Kajaki. And, like, all of those stories, man, it kicked my ass when I read that book. It is excellent. I seriously, I recommend it to anyone listening. There are so many things that, I didn't know about all of that experience. And, like, yeah, you're going back, you talk about, like, you're going to get your ice cream at Walter Reed, but, like, man, that, and that's a thing in its own. Like, I'd love to have some guys who were there who then, like, you go from the battlefield, like, you're talking about calling back from the battlefield. Like, yeah, I can't imagine calling my mom and being like, yeah, I'm hoping I don't lose a leg today. And you don't want to worry them. And you probably don't want them to hear that kind of, like, fatalism in your tone, which is, like, how else are you going to deal with that situation, right? Other than kind of realizing, like, this could be my day. And if I don't embrace that, I'm going to be too afraid. Like, you tell the story of the one guy in his bunk who was crying and refused to go out on patrol because everybody was getting hit. And that was later in the book. And it's like, I cannot imagine going through what you guys went through. And then, trying to call home and trying to be upbeat and regular, or hearing something from home and then trying to, process that as you're going through this situation. So, I mean, you almost have to have, like, two separate lives, I would guess.
Well, yeah, I guess you kind of, like, you take that other one and you just say, hey, you know what? That was life then.
Yeah.
This is where I'm at now. And, I guess you compartmentalize, I'll deal with it when I get back.
Yeah, my dad's a veteran, and that's always his solution to many things. Just put it in a box. Don't deal with that right now. No. You don't worry about that right now. You just keep going. So
the problem is getting to open that box later on, because you do have to face that. I know that was another thing during this. With writing this, and with, you were going through in the bio, hey, you've done this and that and that. And it really was like living life to the fact of you're living fast enough to where you're running away almost from this stuff. And you're like, no, I'm going to deal with it. Don't worry about it. I'm going to deal with it, but it's just not time yet. To where writing this forced me enough to where I had to sit down with these thoughts, but then slow down enough to process it. And some of these realizations, like the thing with the story in Johnston's, I worked really hard to not mess that up. And that's also another reason why I grabbed so many different views and stuff with that. And really my own view of that story, most of that's actually contained in Ben's book, which is why I didn't put a lot of it in there. I'm like, there's no sense to, and I'd rather cover Will Ross's story, because Will got blown over the wall with Johnson and was there the entire time. You know, he saw things and experienced things that I didn't. I was on the other side of that wall. You know, yes, I stepped right over where that landmine was. That could have been me. But I stepped right over maybe 30 seconds prior, you know, and to put that into context and then start pulling apart everything that had happened and that visualization of that Martinic had, woo, with him flying through the air.
Yeah.
And, you know, that crumple on the ground that he was, you know, when Will came across him, that's just, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. From any perspective, it sounds, you know, everybody's got that. And that had to be, you know, you mentioned at the end of the book, your mental health journey, right? Like right after this, where you're, you know, driving crazy and kind of like, you know, pushing a lot of boundaries. And then it's a lot of years later after that you're writing this book. I mean, what was that, you know, kind of like a mental health battle in and of itself, or more of a, like, I got to get this right for all of the people who are hoping that I will get this right? Like, what was was there a balance of two of those?
There was a really separate,
Yeah.
The one with me driving all wild and everything else and having to, you know, coming to the realization that, hey, there really is something underlying there. You need some help. You know, you need to go and talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
You've been kind of ignoring this end of things. And it was just the fact that I was getting depressed. I was going into a funk, you know, and it's really with this book and stuff, I've tried to show, because like during that deployment, I throw everything in. I throw the fact of, you know, man, I almost caused an international incident with the Humvee, you know, in the Mexican standoff.
Yeah.
You know, some guys were just like, you're seriously going to put that in there? And I'm like, if I can't put that in there, someone will either talk about it later and be like, oh, you remember what Yeske did? you know, you're not so it's showing that, hey, I'm only human, you know, this stuff happens. But if I can't talk about that flip side, if I can't talk about the bad side, and really it was just the fact that things were falling apart for me. And, you know, I was going back to the default of things I liked to do. I like to race cars. The street is not the place to do that, you know, and really with me taking that reckless end of things and pushing that adrenaline, and kind of taking the high risk activities, as my outlet, I didn't really see how I was affecting the other people in my life at the same time. And that was a wake up call. I mean, a stranger I didn't even know, I almost got a kid killed.
Yeah, that was a really heart-wrenching story. And I could tell, you know, you're going through those feelings and those things. And so that didn't really pop up as much when you were writing. Writing was more just, you know, get it right,
Yeah.
like present the story in a way. And I love that, like the humility of that, because you're right. Whatever you put out, like people are going to have memories. And this is, you know, it's a hot button topic, even though it sounds just like, oh, this is military history. Well, no, military history also contains like all these stories that are from all these vantage points. So.
One of the coolest things that some people, and I didn't even know this myself until more recently. So if you go down to Fort McHenry, because I'm in Baltimore, and there's something about the commander of Fort McHenry, like for people that don't know, Star Spangled Banner written about the Battle of Fort McHenry being just bombarded, and you look at where they are and you're like, holy crap, these guys just basically holed up in this little bunker and just got shelled all night. And the commander of that installation, he was never the same after that. You know, on how hard they were bombarded back then and just shell shocked and TBI'd and everything. I think it was like he died 2 or 3 years later. And at the time they had said it was due to a heart condition, but they had said that he was jumpy, hyper vigilant, like all of this. I mean, PTSD has existed throughout. They just don't know, I guess, how to put it in the box or how to explain it. Or I guess we're just now starting to unpackage all that end. And, you know, really I like a lot of the stuff within Sebastian Junger's tribe. to where it's talking about how the Native Americans dealt with sitting around the circle and their warriors talking about the instances that happen on the battlefield, the fallen and the good deeds that happen and their triumphs and their failures and everything else. And it's just, I feel like these stories, they're important and they should be told. There's a value to that, you know, mentally, big time mentally.
Oh yeah.
You know, but
I can tell, like, I don't know that I've told this story on the podcast before, but there was a time I was at a wedding and I was wearing my Operation Ward 57 shirt about Ward 57 and Walter Reed. And this man came up to me and just, he's like, why are you wearing that? He thought I must be a veteran, right? Like, why else would you be supporting this veteran cause? And out of nowhere, this 50-some-year-old man who was a year older or younger than my father, who graduated from the Naval Academy, this guy had graduated from West Point, and he's in tears telling me about how he killed someone at the Battle of Panama, and he can't even talk to his wife and children and grandchildren about it. And I'm, you know, he never even told me his name, but I could tell how much it meant to him to offload that story and to tell me that, you know, it was such a moving experience that I wrote about it. And I just, these are things that need to be said because they are. I could just tell from this man's way of getting it out. Like, he needed to get it out. And I just think it's so valuable to do that.
And see, and that was exactly what we were talking about before, where you were saying there was guys that didn't want to talk about it. And I, you know, of course, again, we got the ones that aren't going to talk about it, but some of the ones that did, you know, there was one in particular that I'm thinking of to where he had said when he picked up, you know, hey man, I've been dreading this call, you know, and we had already texted back and forth and stuff. And he kind of, hey, I got to cancel. And I had a feeling why, but I was just trying to be understanding. And then we finally got around to it and we get on the line and he's like, you know, I've really been dreading this call. I'm like, look, dude, we don't even have to talk about that. Honestly, I just want to catch up with you for one, you know, and I think it was like 3 hours later, you know, and, at this point, he kind of poured his heart out about certain stuff and everything. And he's like, you know, you're the first person I've talked to about this stuff in such a long time. He's like, it really does. It feels like a burden's been lifted off of me to be able to talk about this. So thank you for doing this. And thank you for calling. And that right there, that makes every bit of it worth it. You know, if that helped him out and he's struggling and everything, then really this is something that we should be doing and revisiting and you know, bringing this stuff up to talk about with one another. It's important.
Yep. I've had a couple veterans whose stories I've told for various reasons throughout the years who wanted to come on, but then it was like, oh, I can't do it. And if they're listening right now, I want to say, like, if you change your mind at any time, 20 years from now, like, still let me know. I don't know if the podcast will be around in 20 years, but if it is, like, I'll have you on. Or people who didn't know that if they could tell the story and honor the people who died enough or do a good enough job for them. And it's like, hey, that's a huge burden. And you might not ever get to that perfection point, but you still can do it. And it's just the intent, like the fact that you come into it with that heavy intent and you come to it with everything you've got, like that's what matters. And that you're showing up every day for them. And, you know, there's a lot of burdens that come along with those stories, things that could have been done better, things, you know, people that you have to remember. And so it's like, hey, I get it, you know, and that's why I want to hear so many of those stories. Michael and I last year just really talked about, you know, HKIA stories and things associated with the withdrawal. But I said this year we're going back. I want to talk about 20 years of war in Afghanistan from the perspective of people, which is why you're here, you know, like it's important. This was part of what led up to it. And it's why, like you said in the beginning, you know, Afghans are calling you.
And that's what I was just going to say. Like, there's actually one of the most recent was I started posting, and I know everyone says, oh boy, on this one, but I just started posting on Reddit, and there was one of the Afghan boards to where I had posted a picture of, you know, because I one or two posts I'll share in a different community just to kind of like, all right, let's see if there's any interest there. And it was the village of Pir Pamal on the side of one of the mountains. And somebody contacts me on there and he's like, hey, that's my hometown. I'm like, okay. And then he's like, well, we left in 2010. And I was like, well, or sorry, 2012. And I was like, really? Like, and I know exactly what happened in that valley and why they would leave in 2012. But I went and asked him, well, around 2010, what age were you? He's like, well, I was 10 years old. And I'm like, were you some of the kids that would meet us while we were out on patrol? He's like, no, that's why I contacted you. I know exactly who you guys were. And he explained, this particular, I'm not going to like say it out because like then people will start to, how online, and there's always a troll out there somewhere. But he explained this particular area that we would meet these kids like in detail. And I was like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. And he's like, whenever you're in New York sometime, come by, we'll have an Afghan feast with you and everything. And I was like, dude, like, well, if you're down here, and I'm actually trying to get him to one of the events with some of the guys later on, because I just think that'd be the coolest thing. Here is something to where somebody is actually grateful and that we affected in such a way that, he was thankful we were there. You don't always get to see that end. So I think that's been so cool to see that end of it. And just brings a smile,
That's amazing. Quick point of questioning, is 2012 about when the Taliban would have maybe retaken control of Arghandab, or did it just get nasty? Yeah. I was just curious because like Sangin fell to the Taliban long before, like right after we dropped out of Sangin, the ANA, the ANA took control, and then the Taliban pretty quickly swept them out. Yeah. And so I just wondered if Arghandab had the same fate.
No, so they ended up dropping leaflets, and on 5 particular villages, the area was so saturated and the enemy was so embedded within the villages to where they literally just told the villagers, get out of town, and they flattened the villages.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's not really
a lot of stuff you don't hear about. This is those things that you get glossed over. There's, and I wish I had brought the articles. I'll send you some of this stuff, because really what I need to be doing on the website is starting to publish some of this other information and stuff out there, the backstory, what happened out there. Because like they did studies in 2012, and this is another reason why they did that, is they did a ground survey with all the different IEDs and everything. They're like, every 200 meters, there's an IED. Like there's no there's no de-bombing or de-mining this place. There's so many, it's a complete loss.
Yeah. That was like the one time you got those 2 guys with 50 detonators, like it was, and you had all the foreign fighters you were encountering. I mean, that was okay. So there are so many things I wanted to do here, and like we've had this awesome conversation, but I want to start with the deployment. And so you guys were going to go to Iraq. Then you go to Helmand, and you have like the Halloween massacre, and then you get sent to Arghandab. And I want to talk about why you got sent to Arghandab and how we did not learn the lessons that the Russians failed to, that the Russians had already tried this, right? And so you guys were replacing a Stryker BCT.
Yep.
And what happened, let's talk, because you mentioned this in the book, there's the Battle of Arghandab in 1987. And what was the big takeaway from that for like the Russians trying to operate with their
Yeah, that was one of the biggest things. Everything heavy mechanized machinery type stuff. They rolled in with BMPs, and a bunch of Afghans and everything else. They literally ended up losing like a brigade strength unit there. It was nuts. And as we're moving through there, we're seeing heavy drop shoots, and we're seeing, there's an old man with a Russian officer's belt on and everything. You kind of look at that and you're like, oh man, Mujahideen, like this guy knows it, because they're warriors. It's a warrior culture. They know how to fight, and they know that if they're going to fight, that all they have to do is pick and choose their battles. Like they don't have to show their face. They've been there before. Yeah. But as to the Russians' failure out there, I mean, you can start going through Small Wars Journal, as well as some of the other stuff that's published from back then. And you see a lot of the same issues that the Russians had in dealing with their Afghan counterparts. in the vehicle losses, in the tactics and everything. So, I mean, to send not only a striker brigade, but then also the striker brigade that they did, Colonel Harry Tennell was not following, he wasn't following the ROE stuff at the time. You know, I mean, they're going in using counter guerrilla tactics with search and destroy and just a super aggressive posture in an area to where that populace and that segment there, that was just in an immediate, hey, let's band together and push against this. You know, these are bad people. They don't have our interests at hand. You know, so when we got there, you know, the populace didn't know what to think of us. For one, we start walking everywhere and like they're seeing our faces, but they're just like, no way, we're not trusting that. Like, we've been there before. You know, so it took quite some time to be able to turn, I guess, with that hearts and minds and the coin fight and stuff on that end of things. That's anything like that. It's going to take time. Unfortunately, you're going to end up, you're probably having some losses and stuff before they trust you and realize, okay, these guys aren't losing their heads. Maybe this is not what it appears to be to us.
Yeah. And you did. I mean, you did win them over and you did find people who let you,
yes.
you know, yeah, which is incredible. But they, you know, the striker brigade was not able to do that. And I find that many of the things that we learned in Afghanistan, previous people had learned them either in Afghanistan or in other war zones, and we just didn't figure it out. And one of the other things I found so interesting is, right? No. Let's not do that. That's what are you talking about? My mom is a history teacher, and she's always driven home those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it. And it's true in so many circumstances. I want to talk about all the specialized equipment that they sent you for finding IEDs and how well that worked out for you guys.
So whenever anyone says light infantry, you can make a bet that it's anything but. You know, light just means you walk everywhere with this stuff. And in a technological, civilization, what we're at, of course, and especially America, where it's like, hey, the pill or the new upgraded phone, or that's the savior of your problems. Mm-hmm. So we, one of the things we got in particular were these man packs that we'd wear. I think, I'm trying to think of what the name was for those, because the Talon was the GoBots. That was the IED robot, or Wally, if you will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, because I mean, that was something that we got in Helmand, you know, and then of course there's, hey, here's a $500,000 robot you have to carry around with you, and you're signed for it. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I better not lose that. You know, I was just trying to get it blown up.
But didn't it just not go in Arghandab? Like, it wouldn't go over the terrain,
when we got to the Arghandab,
right?
you had to take this, you know, a $500,000 piece of equipment, and you go, oh, well, they're not going to let us modify it, and it's not going to work out here because it needs wheels instead of tracks, just because of the terrain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And not to mention too is the type of bombs we found in the Arghandab and the type of terrain, and it was just a complete different fight. And they didn't really have the type stuff for that particular fight. I mean, not even to mention that when you started pulling things apart and finding out other resources that we could have had, that either, number one, conventional just wasn't used to. Like, if we had, quite honestly, if it's something like they're called a SOD-A, so it's special operations. They do deal with communications. A lot of them, they have guys that go through DLI. It's a small team, and they can listen in, but also triangulate where signals are coming from and everything. But if we had them and a CA team, complete different set of circumstances there, but who knows? But some of this equipment, these man packs that we put on our back,
that's a good story.
The one in particular, I know, we're leaving the wire. So these things are set up in a way to where you have to have these things in sequence, and they put out this massive amount of radio frequency in order to defeat any of the IEDs that they use remote triggers for. So either when they're calling on a cell phone to set off a bomb, or they're using anything remotely detonated. So these things create this massive signal block around them by pushing out counter RF frequencies. So we're leaving the wire one day, and one of the kids is just like, "Hey, Sarge, I don't feel so good," and we turn and look, and he's got a bloody nose. And we're just like, this thing's like a brain scrambler, man. Like, you gotta be kidding me. How much, and you could tell, when we turn these things on, people would get headaches, but that was it. That was the final straw. When that happened, I think we were out with Sergeant Thomas that day, and he led us through one of the canals tactically, and we submerged the units to to pretty much deadline them.
That was hilarious. I'm sure that there are people who would think that was not hilarious, but there's another thing, like you guys had when I was an intern working for the, working for the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, okay. I was looking into all these different technological developments for the war on terror. And one of them was this device that could see through walls, which would have been great for like a cave environment. And I had never seen it implemented. And I remember being this, 21-year-old kid thinking, man, that's fucking awesome. Like, that is a game changer. And here I am reading about like how it actually happened in real life, which probably was about a year after I was reading those articles, as you're out there actually using the damn thing. And how did that go for you?
I mean, you already have these combat loads that are just staggering, and then, hey, here's another 40-pound piece of equipment, but you could see through walls with it. When are we going to get up and what are we going to scan every damn wall in the valley? Like, how's this going to work? The entire region is just covered with, it's every courtyard is cordoned off. Every orchard has a different wall on it. Like, there's no doing that. And it's really what it ended up being was you ended up having to really just pay attention to the environment around you, know what the signs were, but then have the same type of ingenuity that you would see in the Afghan people, quite honestly. It's like when you have guys taking heavy fishing weights, and a kid's fishing pole, and they're swinging this and pulling it back to pop tripwires and stuff. That's the type of thing that was actually effective out there, to where we could carry it and use it and was actually working, as opposed to, hey, here's this big 40-pound, oh yeah, wait, hold on, these are batteries too, and they run out every 10 minutes. Like, what are we going to do with this?
Well, and the other thing is, the ROE is that you have to catch somebody in the act before you can engage them. So what? Like, if you see somebody on the other side of a wall, how do you know? Like, do you see them in placing an IED? Do you see, like, if that isn't the case, then what is the point of knowing that they're on the other side of the wall if you can't engage the target? And I can just see that creating so many extra levels of.
Oh, and the tactics they would use to put things in too were just, like I was talking about with the assembly line, they just send someone by to kind of scout the area, and then they send somebody by and he just drops the shovel next to where it's going to go. Yeah. And then somebody might dig a small bit and then he's out, exactly that. They're not dumb. Mm-mm. They don't want to get caught in the act because they know there's a hellfire headed their way as soon as they do that.
Yeah, for sure. They were very smart about the way that they did that. I think there was always this idea that, Taliban and the people they were forcing, because sometimes people were, I don't know if this was true in Arghandab, but in other areas, people would get forced to emplace an IED so that their fingerprints would be on it. And so sometimes you might have like a local's fingerprints getting pulled into our systems.
Yeah, the hide system. Yes.
Right. The hide. Yeah. And so like, they're not stupid. They're not backwoods. Yeah. They might have less technology than we do, but they are not incompetent. I mean, they took the country back, right? And
that's like a whole
pissed
thing.
Me off about the freaking leaders of this country, because I talked to them about it, and it's like,
oh yeah,
who do you think your
savages enemy is? Or like, oh yeah, and I'm like, that was one of the biggest things when they would refer to them as savages or something like that, and I'm like, great. All I could think of when they said that was Colonel Custer, Last Stand. And I'm like, what did I sign up for?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Here we go. You're underestimating your enemy right from the get-go because you think that they're, because they're not at the technological advancement or, the warfighter that you are, but they have something that you don't, and that's between adaptation, ingenuity, and the fact that they've seen this, they've lived it. That
they
scene.
know we're not going to stick around. They know that this is all like, that the will to stay, while people like you on the ground would have had that will to stay, the people who were sending you there did not have the will to be there and to continue expending the resources and all of those things. So it's like, they just knew, we'll just play the game. We'll just keep doing our assembly line IEDs. We'll keep, and it costs us very little, and it costs NATO and everything. American forces, a lot more. It's really, I'm sure that has to be a difficult. I want to ask you later about what it was like when the withdrawal happened, but I don't want to get into that too soon. I wanted to ask you about Afghan women. I talk to a lot of Afghan women now, especially with all of the rulings that the Taliban are making against them. And one thing that they're saying is, hey, this hijab rule that everyone has to wear the burqa. Like, that's not the way it is throughout Afghanistan. It's in rural pockets like Arghandab. And so you write about the Afghan women in Arghandab, and that's exactly the kind of women that the Taliban want throughout the country. And I hoped that you could kind of describe what lives women were relegated to in the Arghandab.
Oh man. Number one, you would rarely even see them, for one, just because, heat of the day, with one end of things, but they're mainly out of sight. If there's any men around, they're hiding, but rightfully so. I mean, for the love of God, like, some of this stuff, you show your face and you end up getting stoned, or, and they're just at the full mercy of the male crowd that's there. And there's nobody who really sticks up for anybody once it push comes to shove. And it's just kind of that was rough, like having to see kids growing up there, and you're like, man, like, what do they have to look forward to? What is life for them like? And then the women there, I can't even imagine. Like, I mean, that's why you have these issues, and Mikael talks about it and stuff with, the suicide rates and stuff out there. Mm-hmm. It's horrendous, because it's that feeling of, what do you have to look forward to? What's your purpose? What are you actually working towards? And to live in fear all the time like that, I can't even imagine. And that's the whole reason why, guys like us stepped up to go over there and stuff, is to push back against that type of thinking and against that type of person. And here we are, once again.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know if, because so many places around that time, there were PRTs, there were like provincial reconstruction teams, there were different groups trying to bring in schools, trying to get women to be somewhat educated, or at least participating in the economy. Was any of that happening around Arghandab when you were there?
It was not at that point yet. Yeah, I know, because you're talking about like the FET teams and stuff we're working too.
Oh, for sure.
Arghandab was considered too hot to really have that stuff out there. I know a Canadian CA team came through there at one point, just on a brief, survey type thing. But it was just to the point of where losses were, they weren't focused on that at that point. It was, hey, this area is just too saturated. We're not working on that end yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Then that's the feel you get reading this, is like it was like us versus the Taliban, and trying to make that. And you guys did make those contacts and get that safe feeling, that first hearts and minds,
started to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounded like, fast forwarding to the end of the deployment, you advised the unit that followed you. You told them about the Taliban's TTPs, about places to avoid, and there you are at CAF. And what was the first thing you saw that made you realize what the?
Before we even left, it was like everything we had said went in one ear and out the other of the commanders that were there, because like there's a picture of an MRAP, burning, where the crew burned alive over a culvert that we had showed them specifically. You need to clear that every time, because every time we roll by there, there's a bomb. And, you know, it's like, how easy would that have been? Just get out and just clear through.
How
5
did that,
people.
make you feel? Because it's like you've already gone, you've seen, okay, the striker brigade didn't learn the lessons of the
Yeah.
area. You guys had tried, and you lost lives and legs and things like that to learn the lessons
Yeah.
of the area and try to impart them. Like, how did that feel as you're like at the end of the deployment and getting ready to?
Oh, that's definitely like, what was all this for? You know,
Yeah.
you didn't see any of it, especially at that, like that right after thing. It just becomes a very hopeless feeling when, you know, you're having to deal with these, quite honestly, a lot of this, it's egos. It's egos of the hires that come in. I know better. They don't know what they're talking about. And it's like, you know, these guys operated here for X amount of time and like paid for this information with blood, sweat, and tears. You probably should listen.
And it's kind of like something that, before we started recording, I was bringing this up. You talk about, as the guy on the ground, like you can't know all of the things going on outside, like the policy level things, because it'll make you go crazy. Is that kind of how you get through it? Is like you try to not think about those, how do you push through when that's
I mean,
going
that
on and
end.
there's not anything you can do to change it?
So from that level, it really was just what you just said. You know, you have to, all right, this is my job on the ground. I have to stay in my lane, but I also, you know, I can do on the ground what I can do right here in this moment in this space. Like I can't worry about anything that far out. You know, later on in my career, I went over to the civil affairs side at the tail end and started just pulling apart the amount of everything you're talking about, the scope where the strategic and operational starts coming in. And it was just like, whoa, the amount of, you know, at the time when I was over there, I didn't even know, you know, and I look at Arghandab and then later on and I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what a SOFA agreement is. And that's what all this, you don't know any of that stuff, you know, in the beginning. You had no idea there's an actual contract between the US and the country before you get there. That's Joe level, which again is why the book is written the way that it is, to give it that Joe level feel. You know, it's boiled down, and a lot of the guys too, it's written at a high school level because that's where most of those guys end up. They don't really push anywhere past the requirements of what they had been for the military. That, you know, that's kind of one of the other things through this is those rates of people that use that, it's abysmal. But really it can be, you don't have to use it for traditional school, but at the same time too is you can use that traditional school as a buffer to figure out what you're going to do. And instead of hauling trash or, you know, I'm not putting anything against that, those sort of jobs and stuff, but quite honestly, you're made for more. You know, a lot of the vets out there and stuff, you can put up with more. You have the discipline and you have these habits ingrained in you to be able to do this stuff. You know, you need to be out there and you need to be involved in your communities because you've seen what right leadership looks like at one point or another. It probably wasn't your whole career. If it was, man, you know, more power to you. But for the most part, you know, we've seen both ends, but we always have that one leader we can look back to and say, that's what leadership looks like. And that's what you need to bring forward to the community and the people around you.
I love it. I think that's great. And it is, one of those benefits of service is like you get that opportunity to go use the GI Bill and do all those, figure out, what does life look like after the service. But I wonder if that's something with military transition where maybe it's just not, that's a hard enough time, right? So many people have trouble as they're getting out and maybe that's just,
we're starting to tackle some of that end.
Yeah.
that's one of the things in coming out of here that I'm hoping to lay some change to is possibly doing taking on that project as modernizing and scaling correctly, just because the system we have in place, they haven't evolved. You know, it's a lot of the same stuff in place, and quite honestly, it's a glorified resume class. And the resources and the amount of the contracts and stuff that are behind it, you could do so much more,
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Well, and it's
so much
funny, like
more.
I actually covered one of my best friends when he went through his military transition out of the Marine Corps. I asked if I could just, interview him a couple times over the course of that year.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always stuck with me is like, you're training people to transition, but you haven't transitioned. Like, what the fuck?
That's
That
on it
doesn't make
right
any
there.
sense,
No, it's on
like,
it
and
right there.
all of
That's,
it. Like,
yep.
you cannot tell people what it's going to be like if you haven't been through it. You need to have people who've been through it, who understand the emotional load of it, and it differs on depending on person to person, right?
Yeah.
I love that. I hope that you are able to make something move on that front, because it
I have
is
some really solid stuff. I mean, some
cool.
seriously, and some really exciting people that I've talked to as well. So hopefully more of that unfolds soon. We'll be
Cool.
talking again about
Oh
that down
yeah.
the
Oh,
road.
I can't wait. That sounds so amazing. That kind of like this all pulls into purpose and whatever. And so the other thing, like maybe you saw bad stuff happen with the people who replaced you and they didn't listen, but Arghandab and
Hmm.
your deployment did make a difference. It's JIDO. I can't remember the acronym, but they
Yeah,
used
yeah,
you guys as deployment, as joint interagency threat detecting or something like that. They
yeah.
used you guys as deployment later, and
Yep.
it was a positive example of what to do in a difficult IED environment. I think. Can you talk about that, and whether that kind of made you feel like, okay, actually we did
Yeah.
make a difference?
Yeah. It had to do with the special operations end of the house, actually. I was later on going through an area to where they were running an IED lane. And I talked with one of the guys on the side, about that. And I was like, oh, hey, I know about your organization and stuff. Like, where were you guys at about this time? Here's where I was. And his eyes just got here. And he was like, whoa, Arghandab, like, man, you guys pretty much wrote the book on like this section here, because just the amount of different tactics you saw and the IEDs and stuff that they in place, the TTPs they were using, and the way that they were using the terrain and stuff. So hearing that end, it definitely shows you that, hey, look, these losses and stuff, that stuff was not all in vain. There was countless ends of people saved from this information later on. It sucks that we had to be the ones to walk through that.
Mhm.
Um, but it wasn't, again, it wasn't something that was in vain. This stuff is, people learn from it. People put these packages and stuff together, and we move forward more informed. And quite honestly, just the state of some of the guys and stuff that are there now. Like, one of the things with the book launch event, getting to talk with some of the kids from the modern day, like the current unit, first platoon. They sent first platoon down to the Airborne and Special Operations Museum, the day prior to the actual launch event. And that was such a surreal thing. It was so cool to talk to them, but then to experience that gravity of the situation, to where I kind of called out and I was like, hey, is the RTO for first platoon around? And they kind of shoved him up there. They're like, hey, get up there and everything. And then I kind of had this serious sideline with him, and I was like, I hate to do this to you, but quite honestly, like, you need to read this book a little differently. I'm going to give you a copy, but you need to put yourself in the shoes of myself and read that and be like, you are going to be medevacing these guys, and you're going to be the commander's eyes on the battlefield. So you need to treat it differently than you probably have up until now. But then, as I'm leaving at the end of everything, and after I've talked to these guys, he kind of pulls me aside and he's like, I was thinking about this, that, and that. What are your thoughts? And I was just like, he's already like putting things into practice in his head and thinking. And I'm like, man, that is something I would have never started putting together and doing. So seeing that and hearing that from this current generation of like warfighter and everything, I was really cool. Really cool to
That's
see.
super cool. Do you think that's because they are being, and I've heard this term used, like raised by veterans who, or well, service members who saw those tough times? Do you think
I
that's
think
why they're
that
thinking that way?
definitely has something to do with it. I also think that like, I mean, there's our generation to where we sort of had the smartphone, the advent of the smartphone, and everything sort of pop up during that. So they've had it there, and you're seeing just different habits on that. You're seeing kids that are actually shunning the smartphones and stuff and wanting to know more about the environment around them. I think there is like a real thirst for knowledge and stuff. This new generation and like where they're going with things. It's exciting to me. It's exciting to see, and it's exciting to see it in my own kids too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure you see it in yours, and you're
there.
just
Yeah.
like, they teach you in certain ways,
It's super freaking cool. Sometimes it's like, oh God, this generation. But then you see like, wow, they have access to some cool things that we did not, like you said. I want to talk about the hard stuff, saving the hard stuff for last, Operation Resiliency. I think that's when I read Ben's book. I was like, oh, damn, that is a brilliant idea where this nonprofit came together with the VA to sponsor, and I might be getting the details wrong, but to sponsor, and you talk about it in your book as well, a weekend retreat for all of Bravo Company. And the point was, there had been several suicides, and they wanted to bring everybody together and kind of foster, put warfighters together again and let them share their stories and help be there for each other and create these lines of communication. And I'd love for you to talk about how that worked and what it was like, and if you think it's a good model for other
no,
units.
I think it's a fantastic, it's absolutely a fantastic thing. We even took some of that stuff forward from there, but I'll get into that so the whole thing behind Operation Resiliency, it was started by, really it was vested within the Independence Fund, but it was at one of the funerals of one of the guys from that unit. So the people that are in the Independence Fund, and Sarah Verardo in particular, her husband was one of the guys who was wounded pretty badly on that deployment, and has had, it's like 100+ surgeries at this point. And she just has a really big heart for everybody in that unit. And there was, again, yet another suicide, and it was Sergeant Derek Hill. And it was his funeral, and someone turned to one of the other guys and, said, well, I guess I'll see you at the next one. And she overheard it. And it was just like that darkness of like, man, like that's where these guys are at. So this particular unit, has been flagged by the VA, and the DOD as a hard hit unit. Most of the guys that are there don't realize that, like, when they're going through the records and stuff for your VA rating, if they see that unit on there, you're going to get looked at for, mental end of things, and you're going to get looked at a little differently. Mm-hmm. And they kind of took this whole thing and put together a program in conjunction with the VA that was a test pilot program that was more of a peer-to-peer based, and getting these guys back in the room together to start addressing their traumas together. Because really, any veteran out there, you have this instant rapport, especially combat veterans that serve together. They open up about things that normally they wouldn't with other people. And that rapport is there. It's almost like they just get on the phone and they start talking, and you're like, when's the last time you guys saw each other? Like last week? And they're like, nah, it's been like 10 years, and what? It's just there. And I think it's because of the fact that you're trauma bonded, for lack of better terms there. You're really trauma
Usually
bonded.
I hear that term for in different reasons in my life, but I like that I like it a lot better than the other way.
Right. It's a different kind of, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you guys have been through some hard stuff together. Yeah. That bond is there. You've seen everything about each other. Everything about each other intimately. Mm-hmm. And when you do that and you bring up some of these old wounds, they don't have problems talking about that. So what they did for OpRes was they brought these guys in together. They flew them all into Charlotte, North Carolina, as many as they could. And normally where you have a reunion like this, 10, 20 people show up. No, this was like 125 paratroopers coming down on Charlotte. Wow. Yeah, it was something else. It was really cool. And that's actually where Ben Kesling came in, because he was writing pieces for the VA, for the journal through there. And there was clinical psychologists from the VA that were provided and sent in. So in between different team building events and different events to where these guys are interacting again and everything, they had all these personnel and these clinicians and everything, and they were utilized. They definitely were, to where some of these guys might have never even considered talking to a clinician or something before, but because these other guys were there and be like, look, I've been there, you're going to be better off in doing that and everything. And it wasn't even it wasn't like a push or anything. It was just that, no, I've done it. I've been there, and you know me. And they see that and they go, oh, maybe this is okay. And it's done so much good for so many of the guys. And really, I think it's a great model. I think it has so much possibility when used in the right way. And it even went further so when COVID hit, we saw a spike and stuff in veteran suicide rates and stuff. But one of the guys, Dave Huff, was one of the other ones from that particular company. He started an online Zoom chat, basically, that we called veteran peer groups. And we started doing the same thing, just getting these guys back together. And it was in like a business mastermind type format that he just reformulated. But it was the same exact type thing where these guys would get on and he would go around, hey, is anybody having any problems in anything in any areas of your life? What would you say it is? And more times than not, when someone would say, yeah, I'm having either a relationship issue or I'm having a problem in business and stuff, somebody else from the group would be like, oh, I've been there before. Talk to me on the side, and it would, or the group would just address it right then and there if they were comfortable with it. And it's just the coolest thing to see, but also in realizing that a lot of these problems out there are within the veteran space. They are veteran problems, but it's also kind of there's other people out there helping us, but we need to be working with each other to get through it, because quite honestly, that's going to be really the answer.
I totally, yeah. When I've talked to HKIA vets, there's one young man in particular who just, we had a bunch of HKIA vets on to talk about John Kirby saying there was no chaos during the withdrawal. And we wanted them to be able to talk about the chaos they saw. And at the very end of the conversation, Connor McMurray said something that I just I'll never be able to forget. And he had said that, he had tried to kill himself on the anniversary. I don't think then that he mentioned it was on the anniversary of the withdrawal, but just so, he was able to talk about it in such a, that happened, but the reason that it was not something that continued is because he found his community of HKIA veterans who were all trying to preserve their stories. And that was his path to feeling better. And like, I've talked to Connor about it a couple times in the aftermath. I've been able to share his story in the news. And it's like, I hope other people hear that and do it, talk about it and know, like, everybody has some really tough moments, but there is a way through. And there are so many veteran groups out there that I do not know a single veteran who would not rather have a call at 2 a.m. than get the call the next day, like, and that's part of this thing, is building these communities. And that's what I loved about Op Resiliency. Like, at the end, I think they gave out just like a giant graph, like, of here's everybody's contact information. Like, you're never going to be alone again. Yeah. And it's so simple. It's so simple, but it's so much better than, how many times have you heard somebody going to the VA looking for help and not being able to get it, or needing to go and wait for therapy, or being given
particular
drugs.
Story with Sergeant Thomas right there. I mean, he literally went seeking a bed at an inpatient facility just days before, going and killing his neighbors and then killing himself.
Yeah. And that story, talk about a rough story. There are lots of difficult moments in your book and Ben's book and in this whole war. And they're so important to not shy away from, because what can we learn from it? What can we do better? What can we, I wondered too, I've heard lots of people talk, obviously, because of the nature of this podcast, about how the withdrawal became difficult for them. Did you have any experience of, watching the Taliban take control of the country? Was that tough given what you had experienced in the Valley?
I think if anything, it was just, I think we all knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, just because we had some really good people out there. We had, one of the contractors that worked with us, but I mean, he was a local guy, but he had kind of like his own little pocket of power in there, but he was always using that to give back. He was always using it for the future of Afghanistan. Like there was some great people, some really good souls and stuff that I met over there. And that's the most heartbreaking part, is like knowing that, but then seeing how quickly that country just folded, and going, man, that's how little of a resistance was against the corruption end of things, and against, really what the Taliban wanted to do overall. Like, they just, the people didn't care, I guess. They probably do now at this point. But man.
Yeah, I think it was a perfect storm of a lot of terrible things. And I know I've heard that from many people, the people that they touched, like, what happened to them? Are they okay? Like, what's,
Yeah.
There
I know
stays
multiple
with you.
interpreters that, we had, just due to different connections and stuff that we have, from within the company, and then people being involved within nonprofits that were in the company, and everything, to where some of those interpreters and stuff we had were brought over and stuff. But, just the sheer scope of people. And again, like I was talking about earlier on the show, on how, the social media campaign on this is getting even hit up by people, to where that's why I even know about this particular show, is contacting Michael and saying, hey, who deals with this sort of thing and the evac support, who should I trust in here? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I wondered, I think you talked about Gucci and Armani, those two interpreters.
Yes.
Are they here now?
Gucci, the last I knew, he was a quadriplegic. So when he left us, he ended up going back to Helmand province and was blown up, before we even left country.
Mm-hmm.
He lost double amputated legs and one arm, and I don't know, that's actually, you're not the only person to ask that. I've kind of reached out and been like, hey, does anybody have any? Nobody really knows anything about him. But I know one of them, two of them actually, that are out here,
Okay.
they brought over.
Yeah,
But
I'd love
yeah.
to know more about Gucci if you can find out, especially.
He was such a good guy.
Yeah, he's the one whose name comes up again and again. And I know too, there was, there for a special immigrant visa, there's the time and service requirement. And some people didn't meet the time and service requirement because they got blown up. And so if Gucci was in that boat, that's a group I'm always trying to write about, because if you give up 3 limbs to save Americans, I think that It doesn't really matter how long you serve beside them. I think you probably deserve a spot over here, safe. Especially, like, what the hell are you going to do in Afghanistan with missing 3 limbs? Like, you don't have Walter Reed fashioning you prosthetics that let you get through life in Afghanistan like that. So if you ever find out, please do let me know, and I'd love to.
I will
be able to tell that story. But the last thing I want to ask you is just, what have you learned through this process of getting this down, and what do you want people who are thinking, yeah, I want to write it, but it's a long, what would you say to somebody who's in that?
I would say, like, honestly, is just listen to your intuition. If there's something in the back of your head telling you that you should be doing something and you're questioning it, stop questioning it and just start. Because, like, I would have never, like, just a little bit over a year ago when I started this thing, I would have never dreamed that it would be where it's at. Like, I thought it was something that it was going to be just a self-published, just for so that the guys would have. And then here we are with, you know, I mean, we literally have an exhibit in a DoD museum with this stuff is being preserved for perpetuity. You know, people's grandkids and great grandkids can go down there and get this stuff, and you look at it and be like, that's what they did. That type of thing's important, and preserving that end of history, whether you don't think that you really had that big of a role or whatnot, you don't know how you touched other people. I certainly didn't in certain ways. And when you start seeing the full scope of everything, you know, it's quite the thing.
Yeah. And, you know, I think we are looking at it now from this, you know, it just happened, right? It's not that far removed, but I'm thinking about all the times I've been, you know, the Veterans History Project over at
Yes.
Yeah. You know,
I've been down
trying
there
like hell to get
Yeah.
anybody, any living veteran, please just
Yep.
tell your story. And you can go and you can search all these units going back. I think they've got, you know, some Civil War recollections in there. Some of them it's like, you know, a family donated what they had, you know, these things, but like yours is a book, you know,
Well, and
like,
not to mention, I mean, like, this is the stuff I have backing it up as well. Like, so the platoon sergeant from that particular deployment gave me all of the leaders books and stuff. So I literally have the serial numbers of the weapons that were involved. I have the round counts for each engagement. Wow. I have, you know, yeah, it's just the amount of detail. Like, this book doesn't even show that end of things, but I'm also right now I'm working on figuring out how to that particular information stuff. What do I do with that to get that preserved, you know, so that the other guys can also access it on a whim as well. So, I mean, but that stuff's all being worked into getting turned in as well. But once it's been properly, I guess, archived for the guys to be able to reach out to, you know, for their own stories and whatnot. So it is cool. It is cool once you start pulling all this stuff out.
It's amazing. It's like, you know, this is a totally different story, but I had told the story once of someone who's become a friend of mine. His father had survived a Nazi death march by running off and joining this American infantry unit. And they gave him a coat and they gave him a Coca-Cola and they told everybody he's a translator. And, you know, he got over here. In fact, like one of the more senior officers recommended him to come over and said, "Hey, here's our interpreter. He's really good." And they sponsored him to come here, which, you know, at the time of the withdrawal, I thought was an interesting juxtaposition. And so I told this story for Coffee or Die magazine. And lo and behold, I get this message. Hey, I grew up hearing about Mickey Core. Like, I know that. And the thing is, though, the father who told the story had passed away. There was no, you know, no written whatever, but there is somewhere, there's a whole archive of that unit's history. And so maybe some guy wrote about it, but you have to go to that, you know, to that library to go look through those archives to try to find. And so that's why it's so important. Like, you're not thinking right now about who's going to want that story and who's going to want to know some specific small detail that's going to mean something to somebody in 50 years, in 80 years, what have you. Like, it's so important. And I'm glad that that's the path we're going on, that Michael's telling his story, that you're telling your story. Like, these are valuable right now. And hopefully people who are paying attention down the line will listen to them and understand we've been through this. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's not, you know, let's look at what's happened and honor that in our future decision making. I'm so glad you did it. And I hope other people take some, you know.
I hope so too. You know, like, that's actually one of the things through this is that, so I got news just last week, actually. So Charlie Company that I talked about in the book across the river from us that kept getting into, you know, some very kinetic firefights every other day.
Yeah.
They actually just got a publishing deal. I got them in with the publisher. So they're going to have a book. I've seen the manuscript already. It's good.
Cool.
I mean, it's really good. So yeah, 2 Charlies coming out with Devil's Playground. I think it's going to be like another little bit over a year's time.
Cool.
But
Yeah, that was one of the areas, right? Was called Devil's Playground in Arghandab. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Cool. Yeah. Oh man, I'm looking forward to it. I'm already going to put it on my future list of things to keep a
Oh, I'll
lookout
get
for.
you. The author's name is Andrew Bragg, but we'll get you linked in with him because
I love it.
it's a heck of a story, and he brings a different side of it too. Like through his, and that's the coolest thing too to see there is like to see that different end of it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It's like we talked about in the beginning. Everybody has a different experience. And I mean, his is, he was actually in a different area and a different thing, but there are so many unique people who join the military and all of them have a valuable place. You kind of talk about that at the end of the book too, of, there's a place for the nerds and there's a place for the,
Yeah.
for everybody. And,
Yep.
and everybody has that perspective. And that's that richness of our armed forces. I love it.
Well, I also think, I mean, that's really just the richness of America. You look at the diversity of
Yes.
the troops that we had within the Arghandab and the different backgrounds and stuff. That's really the 82nd alone. That's kind of what its claim to fame, if you will, is or was in World War II was, hey, we have somebody from each individual state. That's why we're all American, and that's really, those diverse talents and stuff is what got us to the Arghandab. But quite honestly, those diverse talents and whatnot and how everybody fits into the puzzle of misfit toys, if you will, is what makes up our military.
Yeah.
We're just humans.
100%. 100%. And humans who matter so much and whose perspectives are so valuable, I think, that what drew you to give that sacrifice makes everything that you do from there on
Oh yeah, humans
valuable.
with a
And
purpose.
yeah, that's why we've got to keep veterans here and work on that mental health initiative. I've seen too many good people go, and they need to remember, like, you are here and you are valuable, and we need your spirit, and we need
I
you to
agree.
talk about the things or deal with them in some healthy way because they made you, and you will be stronger than them at some point. I think.
Oh yeah, no, I know exactly. Like where people have that, they accept that narrative that they're broken through this stuff, and it's no, you're not broken. You're never broken through an instance
Yeah.
unless you allow yourself to be. You learn through this stuff. You're
Yeah.
forged,
Post-traumatic
if you will.
growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is growth. There is. Yeah, it's a dark day, but like, let the sun come up, take a
Yeah.
breather. Like, it's anyway. That's a very simplified way to look at it, but it's, there are people who want to listen to you, and
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
stay.
now more than ever too. I mean, there
Yeah,
really is, like with what we have around us and everything. There is people who care.
I totally agree. Well, I do want to say in closing, we always have a story, and today we've done something really crazy. I recorded a conversation with our guest, an Afghan teenager who has been working behind his father's back to help his father's SIV go through.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to cut and play that story. And then I just want to say, for anybody else who is wanting to share a story, we can try the recording. We can take your story in a letter, in a recording. If you want to send a recording, and whatever you want to send us, it can go to the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. And we are really looking forward to hearing your side of it, because really, that is such a valuable part of all of these stories.
So my dad used to be a veteran. He's a general. He used to be a general. Then American came to Afghanistan, the first invasion of United States of America over Afghanistan. So my dad kind of worked with him directly and indirectly. After that, they wanted to send my dad to Kandahar. My mom is a psychologist. She's coming from super healthy and wealthy family, and my mom didn't want my dad to go to Kandahar because my mom kind of thought it was kind of a trap. So my dad kind of listened to my mom, and my dad didn't go to Kandahar. So as a result of that, my dad got transferred to aviation, airport. After that, again, my dad found himself in working with American contracts. So he became a cargo handling agent, import and export. So he has been working for he had been working since 2014 till 2021. Then Afghanistan fell and everything collapsed and everything. So at first he wanted to get his HR and recommendation letter from Ministry of Defense, but things weren't going the way they were supposed to go to my dad. So he said, I'm not going to jeopardize anything. I'm not going to go to Ministry of Defense. So he got in touch with his CEO, Stephen Irons, and he managed to get his HR and recommendation letter from his CEO. And it's been almost like a 11 months that his case has undergone review, and it's kind of a challenging.
I want to thank the teenager who did reach out and wanted to tell that story. And Will, I want to thank you so much for talking about this deployment to Arghandab and about your book and the importance of getting these stories down for future generations and just for now, for everyone now who wants to remember or wants to honor those things that they went through. So this has been an awesome conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, no, thank you for the opportunity. It's been great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, come on back. I want to talk about, we're going to do some transition talk in the future. I'm already putting it down, but
sounds good.
In the meantime, thanks to everybody for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan, for supporting our veterans, and Tasha Kaur, and we hope to see you again soon.